Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ADS Varsity Lectures. My name is Cara, and today we'll start with education. Like every tournament, we will also start with education. It's a good way to be able to get a grasp on how debaters are with their skill in debate. That's why it's usually set as a round one motion. So let's get straight into it. Just a few disclaimers. The first is that this will be less on academia and less on research. So, meaning we won't have the conversations about funding, we won't have conversations about, well, funding for research, and we won't have conversations about blue skies research versus more concrete research. This will be more about schooling. So, how students are able to learn, what should they learn, what kinds of values, what kinds of ways should we teach them, maybe even questions about how teachers are supposed to teach them. Then the second disclaimer is this will feature more Philippine-based examples since the ADS is from the Philippines and we want to be able to provide nuanced matter and conversations about that. So let's get straight into it. Just a few basic tips for education motions. The first is quite obvious, which is to base it off of your own experiences. Everyone has gone to school or some form of schooling, which means that you have some awareness of how these structures work, of what matters to students, what is important for their future careers, what is important for learning now. So all of those values you can definitely apply and use in debate and apply into these motions. So even if it's a very technical thing, so maybe stuff about student loans, you can still take from your own experiences and ground it to the values of what you think students definitely need, what's pressuring them, those kinds of emotions. So don't be afraid of entering these debates, especially in round one, because there is some room for you to be able to navigate. That's why it's always said as round one. But the second tip is to go beyond those experiences. And this is especially important for if you recognize you come from a more privileged background or you have a limited worldview of how the education system works. So if you come from a private school, if you have a private tutor, it probably means that you should also reach out beyond the different contexts that exist. So the students that don't really have those same privileges, it's important to be able to accommodate them and their contexts and experiences within these education debates, because usually they are the most important actors that the motion debates about, since they are the more vulnerable people. So getting into the groove of understanding these experiences is very important to education debates, to be sensitive and also to just win more debates, because it allows you to understand different contexts and win on those contexts too. The last to also help you win more debates is to matter load. So understanding very technical things that are related to education will help you in case that is the topic for that round one education debate, or sometimes not round one, like maybe round like six. So it's understanding what an income sharing agreement might be for students, that in comparison to how student loans work. So there's a few more technical things that education motions can't really fit all of the terms into an info slide. But aside from just those technical things, it's also just general knowledge of how the education system is, what are the current ways that the government is implementing, or current ways that governments are trying to improve education. Is it by advancing or putting more resources into upgrading learning materials? Is it by expanding classrooms? So knowing stuff like that might help you contextualize the arguments you're making in a round, which might help you win more rounds. So matter loading is also important. So those are just general basic tips for education motions. We will now get into the main meat of the lecture. The main questions I listed here will probably show up in most of your education debates. The first being what helps more with learning. The second, where can you access education better? How does education affect the world? And what is education for? So that I saved the most important one for last, since the most common trend I see in education debates that I think should be corrected over time is that there is an assertion that usually many, especially high schoolers, make in their speeches, which is that this it fulfills the purpose of the education system, but without really explaining what the purpose is or why that really is the purpose of the education system. So we'll explore that last assertion at the end of the lecture. But before that, let's go through all the different ways that education motions makes you answer these three questions that I first listed. So on the first question, what helps more with learning? So the way that I organize this is these are the two subsections of motion of different motion types that have the core question of asking you to answer what helps more with learning. So the first subsection, comparing methods for learning, is where you are asked to compare two different methods, or sometimes three, but usually two different methods for learning. And the core question there is asking which one is better. And the other subsection here is evaluating just one model and comparing it to the status quo. So usually this model is newer, like the one you can see, like gamification. Does that really help students? Is the question, or is the main question of all these topics listed. So going on to the first subsection, very I won't go through them very in depth because what I'll do is explain them briefly, maybe insert some matter here and there, but just show you why it leads to the question of what helps more with learning. So the first comparison of methods, or the first motion type that asks you to compare methods, is usually about local languages versus regional languages like English and Spanish, and whether or not which one of them should be the medium of instruction. So what basically a medium of instruction is, it's the language that you use to teach students regardless of what class you're in. So in math, in science, in history, you are using this language. Teachers perhaps in assemblies are using this language. So the motion is asking you which one should schools implement, the local language of that area or the regional language that might be more accessible to the country at large or the world at large, like English. So some important matter here to note, especially if you're a Filipino debater, is in the Philippines, there used to be the Mother Tongue-based Multilingual Education Act. This last year expired since the government let it expire. But before it did expire, what it did was allow the medium of instruction to be the local language of that area or of that school. And there are a lot of things that you can say here about whether or not people liked it, whether or not it was effective or not. The criticisms for it were that the implementation was very faulty. There was not enough money to be able to reprint a lot of the materials within that local language. Teachers were not accommodated within the system. They didn't know how to implement it. But also more importantly, the context of the Philippines is just very hard to find one local language that can represent a whole group of people, especially because our country is very multilingual, that there's so many languages. So picking just one local language also defeats the purpose of trying to include as many students as possible. So those were the criticisms of the act. The other criticism of not having this act was that this might let cultural languages die out, because if we're trying to prioritize English, it means that these students practice the language less, practice the traditions that are associated with that language less, perhaps in the future. So that is probably what you would also run if you're trying to defend why local languages were important, that this is important for cultural diversity, and we just need to improve the implementation of it. But on the other side of the argument, to talk about regional languages like English or Spanish, you would probably argue, so you would state those things about why it's kind of ineffective. Then you might talk about the main case would probably be about how you can educate students to learn in English, which means that in the future they'll be able to use English, which means you can use it in the workplace, in college, wherever else they might go, which is a very handy tool for being able to compete in the job market, all those other benefits you could probably think of being able to speak in a regional language versus just your local native tongue. And that is usually the debate. And the main core question there is just asking what helps more with learning for that student. Is it more important that this learning that they get happens right now, that they don't have a barrier to understanding common subjects like math and science because it's said in English versus their local language? Or is it more important and they need to be able to learn English right now so that in the future they don't struggle with it, that they can advance themselves in the workplace? So that's why it heads towards that main question. The second prong here is specialization versus general education. And here it also asks, or it points to the question of what helps more with learning, because it's asking you what type of subjects, what type of learning is important for students. So in specialization, or when you're trying to defend specialization, you're emphasizing why it's important that students learn a specific niche, a specific field of study, fast, but also very in depth, Versus when you're trying to defend general education, you're trying to explain why you need a more holistic approach to studying. So you need to learn both science and the humanities at the same time so that you have a better way of understanding the world versus just involving yourself fully into science. A good example of this in the Philippines is probably the strands. A more global example would be the US and the UK. So in the UK, you can specialize very quickly because of things like A levels. You can also get a law degree. Well, not you can't be like a fully operating lawyer after 3 years, but it's much faster. It's much closer to becoming a lawyer than in the US, where you have to take a pre-law degree and then enter law. So the pre-law degree has no preparation whatsoever, has very little preparation for the court systems in the US versus how in the UK it's pretty integrated already and you get a lot of experience just from those first 3 years. So it's that example that helps you visualize what kinds of education systems you're comparing. And the main question there again is just asking you to, it's just what helps more with learning? What do students need? Do they need that holistic like breadth of knowledge so that they can understand the world completely, or do they need to just skill build really fast and then enter the workplace and then maybe get some life experiences elsewhere? The third prong here is streaming by learning ability versus by age. So here, streaming means that it's organizing students into different classes or into different grade levels. And the motion would usually ask you to compare what is better for students. Is it better for them to be organized by how quickly they can learn, how high their grades are, versus just by age and how old they are? So the status quo usually is just by age level. So everyone within the 12th grade is like 17 to 18 or whatever it is in your country or whatever it is in your school, versus what it would look like to stream it by learning ability is everyone within the 12th grade has maybe like 4.0 GPAs or like very high grades and are about to graduate already, regardless of age. So maybe there's a really, really bright 14-year-old there, or perhaps this person who was a little bit delayed, maybe they are 20, but they're still within that age range or within that learning ability. So it's being able to compare these two models. The way that you have to guide yourself is asking what is better for students, and not just students individually if they are very smart or if they are falling behind, but also maybe students as a whole. So we'll talk more about this later. This is an example I'll bring up again. The last one for comparing methods of learning is which the motion type I usually see is a little more abstract than the rest, which is memorization versus practical experience. You'll probably see this more in high school competitions, or it's more implied within the motion. So a good way that this is example of how this is implied within motions is the motion of this house would ban open book tests or things like that. Like it just asks you whether or not it's a good thing that you have open book tests. And that implies the clash of, should we just have memorization? Should students really be by the book, knowing all the facts, all the statistics, all the procedures, and versus should they have practical experience, like things like internships or understanding of the concept, not really memorizing what it means. And obviously this motion won't come up a lot, but it's a good thing to ask and to have yourself be guided by, again, the question, what helps more with the learning? So should students know all the facts versus should they have more experience to practicing the facts or understanding them through different applications, different like activities aside from just reading the book. So we'll also bring this up later. The last thing under this is to discuss the subsection of evaluating just purely one model. And I have three examples of how this motion type is usually used, which is one, exclusive schools. And exclusive schools, here, usually the motions are about all girls schools, schools for a specific ethnic minority or just a marginalized group. So it could be schools for LGBT people, etc. So the motion asks you to, if this is good for that individual, those vulnerable communities, does that help with their learning? Another example is of evaluating just one model is standardized testing. Is it a good thing that we have things like college entrance exams, like the SATs, like in China, the Gaokao. So all of these standardized tests, do they make it better for students? Does it pressure them too much? Does it actually force them to learn and, lock in and understand the concepts that they're learning versus just do whatever and answer some quizzes that the school might have an incentive to make easy? So standardized testing is another way that you have to ask yourself what helps with students absorb that knowledge. And the last is gamification. And under gamification, this one's a newer motion type. It's a little bit more rare, but when you get it, it's important to know that that gamification doesn't just have to be the total, like it doesn't have to be too extreme. It can be these small things in classrooms, like having little competitions, having, if you know, Kahoot, or those new games that incorporate ways of being able to participate in class through learning. So you again use your own experiences of how gamification has been implemented. And the question here is also, again, what helps more with learning for those students? Does the gamification mean that you're paying attention, or does it just mean that you're distracted by that game? So we talked about very briefly all these topics and gave a few examples of what they look like. Now we can talk about what are the win conditions to be able to win by answering the question of what helps more with learning. So it's pretty vague, right, that question. So the way that you can answer it first is to get into the weeds of explaining how you get from point A to point B to concluding that this is definitely good for a student's way to learn in life. So a good example, we can use again the memorization debate. A lot of the memorization debate might just be assertions from both sides. So the team for memorization will say, no, it's obviously a great thing that you can memorize because then you can understand. And then when you understand, that's when you learn a lot. That's when you're able to do well in tests. Then obviously the side that supports more practical experience will just say the same thing. Like practical experience will lead to understanding, will lead to them learning. So if you get to that point of the debate, the more important thing to do is to get into the weeds of explaining how you understand through memorization, and then calling out the other side for just asserting that you suddenly get to students learning more. So a good way maybe to explain it is to say that what memorization allows you to do is take in facts and frees up your brain power within the test to focus on understanding more abstract concepts or more difficult concepts that you cannot comprehend yet. So that means that you have more brain power to spend because you already have some of the basics down. You already know some of the concepts because you've memorized them and you have it already there in your head. You can use it as a tool to understand more difficult concepts. Another thing is to explain Perhaps another way to explain why memorization is good for understanding is it trains the skill of focus and being able to allow students to concentrate. So because memorization takes a lot of just sitting there, reading the same text and reciting it to yourself, it teaches you to be locked in, like focused onto the topic that you're learning. And that allows students to really understand lessons in the future because not only do they, get the knowledge of it, but they have the patience to sit there and listen to you. So that's a better way of explaining that memorization leads to understanding because there's more illustrations of how that happens for students, what happens within their brains. And that helps a judge see that you are putting in the effort to proving your point and to proving the mechanism. So they probably might give that class to you. The second condition to answering the question of what helps more with learning is finding and debating the middle ground. So we can also talk about the streaming. So, sorry, we can talk about the example we can use here is specialization versus general knowledge. And some debates will force you into very uncharitable frames of some debates you might take uncharitable frames. So if you're trying to defend why it's important that students are able to specialize, you might really go hard on the frame that we need students to know absolutely everything about this topic, about being a doctor. And what are they going to learn if they learn theology or if they learn humanities? Then they're going to have to spend 60%, 70% of their time using information that they will not need in the future. This is an absolute waste of time. The other side will just say the exact same thing, that you are spending 70% of your time on a very niche topic that might not really help you in the future, that you might not understand and you spend 30% of your time learning actual important things about the world, like learning social sciences, learning how to vote, but you need a lot more. So the deadlock here is just that you guys are both explaining that you need this information more without coming to the middle ground, which is you might not get 70-30. You might get a more even split of different ways to access this knowledge. So I think a more charitable frame for for explaining why specialization needs to happen is that sure, maybe when we're defending specialization, maybe on their side they can also have a lot of time and investments into just learning science, but what we want to prioritize specifically in school is learning more science, so having it become 70-30 and having it become 80-20, because maybe there is some knowledge on their side, maybe they can specialize on their side, but what we want to explain is we can more easily trade off the amount of time that you spend in school because you can get general knowledge elsewhere. And getting general knowledge elsewhere means that we can afford to have more time put into science. So it's not as much of a trade-off anymore because you're explaining the middle ground of you can have specialization, but the emphasis you want to put is there already might be some amount of general knowledge that you can get for students anyway. So you're not too uncharitable saying that there is absolutely none on their side, but you're contextualizing it in a different way, explaining a trade-off and debating the more middle ground area of the debate. So let's think of another example for this. We can talk about memorization versus practical experience. Here on memorization, and again the example of like open book tests. On memorization, the side might argue that it's incredibly important that students know what they're doing. On their side, they don't even know what they're doing. They do not know basic concepts. On our side, we definitely do. Then the other side will claim a defending practical experience will be maybe we don't memorize things, but they don't understand things. So clearly the deadlock here is you know things versus you don't understand things. The middle ground there has to be you probably can memorize more, but you also understand a little bit more on their side, or you have different ways to be able to explain it, or it takes you a little bit more time to think of it, but you do know basic concepts. So there's a middle ground there that needs to be debated. So also you don't sound too radical and extreme to the judge, because if you just say when you're defending memorization that the other side just does not know basic concepts, then obviously that makes you look uncharitable. The last win condition is to think of different contexts of students to weigh and win issues. The example that I'm going to use here is the streaming by learning ability versus by age. So a lot of people might gravitate to separating the debate just purely to talk about why it's important that students who have very high learning ability can advance themselves in the workplace. And then the other side might talk about, oh, but what about the students who get left behind? So since those are two different contexts of students, it's a good thing for both sides to use the opposing team's frame as well, and to use their context as well to also be able to expand the ways that they want to win. So you also want to explain why people who are a little slower in learning can have a better community of students who they don't feel as pressured around because they are all at the same pace. So being able to touch on different contexts of students is very important, and not just banking on fully that one characterization, because it allows you for more ways to win, but it also allows you to fully engage with what might be the frame of the other side's case. So that ends the question of what helps more with learning. We can now enter the question of where can you access education better? So a lot of the motion types about education and access to education are about the inequalities within it. So here are a few motion types, which is one, asking public versus private scholarships. Is it better for students to be able to access scholarships that are offered by companies? Maybe they are a little more sketchy because they're from companies that you don't know if you can be well regulated or not. Or is it better that they just turn to the government, where maybe there is less funds to go around, they might be more trustworthy? Another motion type is so here are a few acronyms. I will expand them now. The income sharing agreements. So what that means is that instead of student loans, you have you allow companies to take a part of your income when you graduate and you get into a job. The other term for this is human capital contracts. So there are lots of variations of what this looks like in the world. Different companies that offer different rates, different kinds of structures, but usually what it does is that they have an income base and they have a threshold. So there's an income base, which means that you don't just start paying after graduation, but you have to wait until you are of a certain income base, and then you can start paying back the loan. So these structures of ISAs are more unregulated since they are newer to the education sphere versus the student loans that are largely given by the government, that are largely given by more trusted organizations like world organizations for not world so that are more trusted national organizations or uh non-governmental organizations. The last kind of motion type that is usually involved into accessing education is, should we allow for certain privileged institutions to continue to exist? Not because they take away access, but that they increase inequality gaps within education. So it's stuff like private schools and charter schools. Are they good for students, or do they just make it very easy to get to the top and stay at the top because you have a private echelon of people turning to an education institution? Instead, should we just put that money all back into public schools? The debate around charter schools are also around the same concept, which is that charter schools are privately owned schools by companies, by organizations, not really the government anymore. Should we allow them to continue existing? Sometimes they're for profit. Do they just take away money from marginalized communities that we should, again, put back into the public system, public administration? So again, there are three win conditions to answering the question of what can you access, where can you access education better. The first is to acknowledge that the actors behind this provide very different ways, very different kinds of investment. So you usually see the difference is like public versus private, and the important thing here is to explain their incentives and how they differ. So this means that you want to explain why the government might be kinder to students because they care about them, because those students will be future voters. Private institutions, you want to argue that they have a profit incentive, they don't want to scam you, or else it looks very bad for their brand. So being able to tell that the actors behind this is different will lead you to those intuitive arguments of explaining why they're better for students or not, especially for the second prong, which is the income sharing agreements or versus student loans. So those are two different institutions. Income sharing agreements are usually private versus student loans. There are some that are private, but a majority of them are publicly owned. At least are publicly given from the government. At least in at least in countries like the U.S. So that just explains why the incentive analysis makes it intuitive. The second win condition is to break down technical differences. And here it's important to understand this is where it's important to have the matter behind it, or a little bit of research, or paying attention to the info side closely. So, an example again on the second problem, income sharing agreements versus student loans. So, in income sharing agreements, maybe the technical terms here is one, that they don't accrue interest, and this means that they don't increase the payment, or it's not they don't have the same interest that increases as student loans do, because it's an income sharing agreement. It just takes part of your income. But the problem is with a lot of income sharing agreements is that they are largely unregulated. They market themselves not as private loans. They don't use the word loans. That's why they're called income sharing agreements. But they are technically private loans under the regulations, at least in the US. So they're kind of shady in that way. They don't want to seem like loans because they don't want to make people think that it's a very big investment when it actually is. Another thing to think about with income sharing agreements or human capital contracts is that they don't have a set amount that you have to pay, which might be good if you don't have enough money to pay, which means that you don't have to reach that initial investment that they put into you. But it can be very bad because if you have more income than you expect, then they will just keep taking it. The repayment cap is two times the amount that they invested into you. So that means you can just pay twice the amount of your tuition or twice the amount of whatever thing that they invested into your education for, which is probably very bad because twice the amount is a very big amount for that to a very big amount of money for you to have to spend on to those institutions. Then there's also an argument for explaining why income sharing agreements are good because there is an income base that they have to be able to reach. Like I said earlier, so usually in student loans, you have to pay 6 months after graduation. Well, obviously there are student loans that don't have the same term, but you can argue that a majority of them do. So maybe income sharing agreements are better because you don't have to pay right after 6 months. You can wait until your income is in a pretty good place and then start paying back. But again, bringing back the first win condition, the incentives here might be that you can break down all these technical differences, but they might have more perverse incentives to make the income base very low. So once you get any sort of job, you just automatically have to start paying it back. So the importance between the first and second win condition is you want to explain the incentives, but you also want to explain what the inherent differences are. Where you when you have the matter and the technical differences down, it's easier to one illustrate how those incentives manifest or how they look like in the real world. But it also helps you to guard against the language and rhetoric of some teams that are like, private companies, they're evil, they're bad. So you just want to have the matter to be like, actually, they're not that bad. Here's the examples. So that's the technical differences that you can bring up into debate and use as a win condition. You can say, Judge, here are the very literal ways that they differ and the inherent ways that we have to win because we don't just argue on fluffy rhetoric. The last win condition for this is where can we increase investment? So this is where a lot of closing material can come from. Not just how you can access education initially, but where you can push that access. How do we get more people are investing into education? How do we get a bigger pool of funds? Again, we will bring up the example of income sharing agreements. A good way to be able to argue in closing, perhaps if you're opening already took up all those arguments about why it's a good thing to have students have more access to or it's a good thing for students to have access to tuition money without having to pay a student loan that might leave you in debt. So you might push it and say, these private companies, because they are dependent on your income, therefore have an incentive to make sure to connect you to employers, to make sure that you do get an income. So they have an incentive to allow for childcare if you need to go to some interviews, maybe some other support programs. So that's how you can explain and push the benefit that you actually get more than just access, but you get more investment into this person versus if it's just a student loan and there's no incentive to really care whether or not they pay it back on um whether or not they pay it back on time because it's you can just you recover that money elsewhere. So the another example of this is private schools and charter schools. It's a good thing to already argue the things in opening, like all the stuff about like, oh, this expands access to education because not all private schools are just for the very rich. They can also just be privately owned and priced very low so that because companies have the opportunity to do this because they have a lot of money and they also want to be able to expand their brand in these places. So that's maybe an argument you can run. But another more convincing argument is that this just adds more money into funding education. And this is important because you would not have gotten this money if companies did not see that they could benefit from the education system. And on the opposition side, you obviously won't have private companies randomly investing into public schools. So this just means that we have more money put into learning materials, more money put into schools in general, which relieves the burden from governments. And that's a different way to frame the argument that opening might already run, that it's good for access. Here's you're expanding and pushing the boundaries, which is saying that you get more access and more investment actually. So that's generally the question of where can you access education better. So now we can move on to the second to the last question. How does education affect the world? And this question will touch on the different contexts that exist. The first being post-conflict states or states with different ethnic tensions, religious tensions, social economic tensions, just any tension, and how does curriculum changes, educational changes affect those students within those states? And how does school system as a whole affect the state as a whole, the country. The second context is promoting narratives. So how do students get affected when you teach them nationalism, individualism, and how does then that also affect society? So there are three win conditions. The first being that narratives do not exist in a vacuum, that they interact, and the team that is very good at illustrating how they interact will win the debate. So let's set an example. An example is in the context of the motion, individualism versus communitarianism. You might argue the very simple argument of saying that individualism is important. We need to have people who are self-interested because that makes them succeed in the workplace, that makes them very motivated, and that means they can advance themselves and contribute to society. So what that lacks is an analysis of who already teaches or believes in individualism. You might want to characterize instead that the rest of the world is very communitarian. So maybe your family tells you to always give back. Maybe your society always guilts you for not staying within the country and leaving. So what schools need to do is be that person that says it's a good thing to prioritize yourself. So because you illustrate how different narratives in society already occur, or how different narratives in society already interact, it means that you can very carefully place your arguments and also make them seem a lot more relevant and a lot more charitable. The second win condition is explaining who your narratives are controlled by. So now we can talk about the nationalism example. And here you want to explain that nationalism is a thing that schools can, if you want to explain why nationalism is good, you might want to characterize why the people who propagate or spread the narrative of nationalism are people who actually have genuine love for the nation, who have very good criticisms, but do it out of love. Because the very easy thing that opposition might say to this is schools should not promote nationalism, because nationalism is already a tool of the state to be able to use to like generate propaganda, or to say that it's a good thing for you to stay in the country, or it's a good thing for you to support our government because we love X country. And schools hopping on to that trend of saying that nationalism is also good means that you give more power to the state to be able to say, so schools already are forwarding this narrative. We're going to further meddle and force schools to do XYZ when talking about nationalism. So you want to characterize why people, or why schools specifically being able to engage in nationalism is a good thing. So you can even concede to that frame and say that it's a good thing that schools interact with the narrative of nationalism, because even if right now it's controlled by the state, it means that schools can reframe what that nationalism looks like and control some of that narratives for students. So that's a way to be able to engage with the debate, because now you're engaging with how it looks like in the real world. You look a lot more realistic too. The last is to ground your impacts. And here's where we will bring up the first motion type example. Post-conflict states, or states with tension. A good example of matter within this is the policy in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that is the two schools under one roof policy, where they're trying to put together schools with very different ethnic groups, but trying to make sure that their students are learning together. But the problem is that they learn in different classrooms and they have different curricula. And you want to illustrate that this, if you're trying to defend two schools under one roof, you want to illustrate that this is very important for bridging together tension. Because if they just separate and if they continue to have different curricula, it means that there is no step to being able to integrate further, or there's no step for reconciliation. And that's a good way to be able to ground your impacts, to explain why that's a good way to ground your impacts, because you're not just all the way saying that, oh, this means all out war, but you're just saying that there is no further step in being able to bridge together these countries. Another way of being able to ground your impacts is to think about how, if you're talking about nationalism, for example, or sorry, rather obeying authority, a way to be able to ground your impacts isn't just to say that schools will brainwash these kids into just listening to anything that they say, but maybe take it slowly and explain how does this really affect their lives. This means that they will listen to teachers who have very biased takes on history. So, for example, if they have a very nationalist teacher who doesn't want to talk about the war crimes that their country did, then they will not talk about the war crimes and they will never learn about the war crimes because you want to obey authority and only listen to their point of view. So, it's being able to one by one explain, step by step, explain how these students are affected when they are taught a certain narrative and how does that affect their life. So that explains that question of how does education affect the world. We will lastly move on to the final question. What is education for? And I would argue that this is the most important question because, as I said earlier, this will answer the assertion of this fulfills the purpose of the education system. But aside from answering that assertion, it also just is the most important question in education debates because it is what every argument is pointing towards and what every clash will ask you to weigh. So let's take an example from the very start of this lecture, which is specialization versus general education. And in specialization, you will want to argue that it's a good thing to skill build, and it's a good thing to be able to have education right now when you're young. And then for general education, you would likely say that the real world exposure is more important. And right now, when you're a kid, you really can't pick what niche you'll want to go into. So it's a timeline thing. You need to have general education first and then specialization down the line. So those are the things that I listed here already. Those are the values of what education really is for. Teams will argue whether or not it's for skill building. They will argue whether or not it's for being able to expose yourself to the real world. If it's good for just personally developing yourself. If it's a good thing because of the timeline that you're too young right now or too old. And the other thing is the nation building aspect of it. So if you want to take an example from the last motion slide, it's if you want to have nationalism, maybe you shouldn't have students learn nationalism because there are some harmful effects to it that you can name. But it's a more important thing to have nation building and have everyone believe in one identity. So maybe there are different ways of being able to assess what is good for students. So that is why it's important to be able to ask what is education really for? And not just ask and assert that it's important for skill building, it's important for a timeline, because that's what debates will ask you to very lastly resolve. Why is it important? So you have to be able to explain why each of these values are important, or you have to explain as rigorously why each of these values are important. So an example of how to do this, let's take an example from the first slide again, which is exclusive schools. Maybe you want to have an all-girls school, or you want to enter into an all-girls school or an exclusive school for just LGBT people. The argument you might run is that it's good for skill building because you're away from all that harassment and you can just focus on yourself. The argument the other team will run is that this is important for real world exposure. If you're in a co-ed school or if you're in a school with even people who might bully you for being part of the LGBTQ community, maybe it's an important thing that immersion happens now versus later down the line and you don't know how to deal with bullying or microaggressions. So that clash just asks you, what is education really for students? Do students need you to skill build? Do students need that real world exposure? Perhaps a way to be able to break that deadlock is using another component of what education is for. So maybe saying that it's a timeline thing. You want to explain that students right now, when they're very young, they're just kids. So they don't really need that real world exposure. Then they're exaggerating that claim that you need to be able to understand how to deal with microaggressions because microaggressions will always feel bad. You don't need to start feeling them now. You can get used to them later because it's a timeline thing. Maybe you can also argue that it's on the other side, or if you're trying to defend why they should be incorporated into co-ed or there shouldn't be exclusive schools, you might want to argue that education is for skill building, and this is also another part of skill building. So you're trying to co-opt their value and say that you get more skill building actually because you're immersed in environments where teachers are very different, and you're not just learning knowledge skills, but you're also learning social skills that are equally as important that you might not have learned. And that's a different way to be able to reframe the real world exposure, to argue that education encompasses those kinds of skills too. So it's a very vague question, admittedly, but you still have to answer it and find ways to be able to resolve those different deadlocks. The last thing I will answer is tertiary education really important? And this is another debate type that will fall mainly under what is education for. And this tertiary education really important. The debates around this are about glorifying college education. Should we still have people aiming for bachelor's degrees? Should they just go into trade schools? Should they just go into internships? And the debate of this will talk a lot about student loans, we'll talk a lot about finances, but it will always just go back to the question of what is education really for people. This really important for skill building? Does tertiary education, like bachelor's degrees, stuff like that, does it really help you enter the world? Does it help you understand yourself? Because the argument you could make here is that maybe it helps you with some skill building, but it doesn't like expose you to how jobs actually work. That's why jobs still have to do retraining or training once you enter that job. So maybe it's a good thing to just go into a trade school or go into a program or go into an internship because you're already exposing yourself to the world. And then the other side would just say that, well, skill building is still more important because it's what you need to learn first before real world exposure so that you can get those basic concepts down, stuff like that. So that motion type will always just ask you, what is education really for these students? Aside from all those technical stuff about finances, it will go back to that main question. So this ends the lecture and it ends our discussion about education debates. I hope you learned a lot. If you want to take away anything from this lecture, I hope it's just learning that education debates will encompass many different contexts, many different narratives, many different technical terms and matter as well. So the important thing is to just be kind with yourself as you go through all of them, but also go through them one by one and be able to really fully analyze each motion and understand how this is truly affect students, how this is truly affect the world. So that is it. My name is Cara again. Thank you so much for listening, and that ends the first episode of the ADS Varsity Lectures.